And the first panelist that I'd like to invite here to give her talk is Jennifer Lynch. She's a senior staff attorney with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and she works on open government, transparency, and privacy issues in new technologies. She successfully sued the Federal Aviation Administration and Customs and Border Protection to obtain thousands of pages of previously unpublished drone records. And she has also testified about facial recognition and its Fourth Amendment implications before the Senate Subcommittee on Privacy, Technology, and the Law. That's pretty awesome accomplishments to have. So please, Jennifer, let's welcome her with a round of applause. I'm going to do this trick, if I may. Here we go. And we can navigate it from perfect.
Hi, can everybody hear me okay? Mike's okay. So thank you so much to the conference organizers for inviting me to come speak. I think it's a great topic to look at surveillance and governments and think about some of the policy issues that are raised by that. I'm an attorney at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and we are an organization that looks at privacy and civil liberties issues with new technology. And we do that on a few different fronts. We have a number of lawsuits against the federal government for surveillance. Rebecca this morning mentioned a lawsuit we had against AT&T from 2005 for the NSA's surveillance. We also consult regularly on legislation. We have an international team that works internationally, and we have a team of technologists who not only explain the technology to the lawyers on staff and the activists on staff, but also consult with other organizations and technology companies on how to design technology that is more friendly to privacy and civil liberties. So this is what I'm going to try and cover very quickly today. It looks like a long list, but I thought it was important to talk about what privacy is so that we're all on the same page. And then a quick overview of the Fourth Amendment for the non-lawyers in the audience. And then some background on some of the surveillance technologies that we're seeing today, visual surveillance technologies, how the Fourth Amendment impacts other rights, and then finally, what does this mean for the future? So first, what's privacy, and why is it important to society? So privacy is actually not written into the U.S. Constitution. It's sort of made up of some of the other rights that we have in the Constitution, whether it's the right to free speech or under the First Amendment, or the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures under the Fourth Amendment. But it is written into constitutions of several states in the United States, and it's written into the laws of other countries. But basically, it's a fundamental human right, and that's because it's really important for us to be able to function in society, to have the space to come up with who we are, to establish who we are for ourselves before we do that for society. So privacy is really having control over our personal information, how it's spread, and how it's interpreted. But it is a balance because we live our lives socially. We share information about ourselves all the time, whether it's with our friends or our family or our networks. And it's also a balance because law enforcement does need access to private information to solve crimes. So the Fourth Amendment is basically a Fourth Amendment to our U.S. Constitution that protects us from unreasonable searches and seizures. And it requires that there be specific warrants based on probable cause for law enforcement or the government to get access to our personal information or our effects. And it applies to everybody in the United States, regardless of whether you're a U.S. citizen or not, but it only applies to actions of the government. It does not apply to actions of private companies. Now, the problem is that the Fourth Amendment was written in the late 18th century. So how do we apply an 18th century rule to 21st century technology? How do we map, somehow lost my presentation. Let's see if I can get it back. There we go. It's the government coming in. So how do we map an amendment that protects, it literally protects people, houses, papers, and effects? How do we map that to the personal data that we generate today, to ubiquitous cameras that are running powerful data analytics? And this has been a problem that the courts have dealt with recently. The Supreme Court had a case a couple years ago that looked into GPS tracking on cars and the ability to track somebody's movements through public 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 28 straight days. And the court recognized that this is a problem because there's no comparable situation from the 18th century. It was just not possible to conduct that kind of ubiquitous surveillance. So what does the Fourth Amendment mean? Well, after the late 60s, early 70s, the way that the court looked at the Fourth Amendment was this reasonable expectation of privacy test. And it's a twofold requirement. The first requirement is that somebody has to show that they have a subjective expectation of privacy. They personally think that their information should be kept private. And then the second part is that society needs to accept that that expectation is reasonable. But there are several exceptions to the Fourth Amendment that the court has found where the Supreme Court, has said that there's no reasonable expectation of privacy, and these apply to video surveillance and cameras, ubiquitous cameras in society today. One of those exceptions is information or things that we expose to the public. The court has said in the past that if we're just exposing it to the public, we can't really think that, we can't believe that that information should be kept private. Another exception is information we share with third parties. This is based on some cases that looked at sharing bank records with your bank and calling records with your phone company. But now law enforcement is trying to apply that to the information we share with third parties, whether it's our email or our photos that were uploaded to Facebook, or maybe even the video feed from private security cameras outside our houses or our businesses and sharing that with the government. So there's some other problems with the Fourth Amendment. If we're basing it on this reasonable expectation of privacy test, does that change as technology advances? So for example, if I know that the government is doing surveillance, like with all the revelations from the Snowden leaks about the NSA's surveillance, does that reduce my expectation of privacy? And especially, does that reduce my expectation of privacy or the expectation of privacy that society considers reasonable if I continue to use technology or to accept the use of technology knowing that that surveillance has occurred? So let's talk about some of these types of surveillance and what this means. Well, one of the things we've seen at EFF is this trend towards technologies that are cheaper, easier to use, and they're more prevalent and more pervasive. And this means that there is an increased technological capacity to collect, store, search, combine, and share data. So what does this mean? Well, it means that for the smallest law enforcement agency, it becomes much easier to conduct surveillance on citizens living in that jurisdiction. And it's also easier for those small law enforcement agencies to share their data with larger law enforcement agencies, whether it's a regional agency or whether it's the federal government. And we've seen this so far with drones, where a lot of agencies are getting grants from the federal government to purchase drones. We've seen it also with surveillance cameras, video analytics, and face recognition. So some of the technologies that we are concerned about at EFF include video cameras. There are already 6,000 cameras that are linked in Manhattan, and that includes 3,000 just in lower Manhattan. Manhattan, or the New York Police Department, worked with Microsoft to develop a domain awareness system, and that links the video feed from these cameras with public databases. So the police have access at their fingertips to not just the images in the camera, but also DMV records, property records, just about anything that would be in a public database would be linked to this system. And the other thing that's happening is that these video surveillance systems have back-end analytics tools that allow law enforcement to track one face as it moves from place to place, to look for suspicious activity, whether it's leaving a package on the platform in a subway. I don't know what's going on here, but I'm gonna. Looks like AT&T wants me to connect to Wi-Fi. Talk about surveillance. So I think the biggest problem with this is that if you live or you work in an area like Lower Manhattan, your whole life could be tracked. This is another example of some surveillance technology. This is a gigapixel image. This was taken from the Stanley Cup in Vancouver, British Columbia. And it's an image that's stitched together from about 200 photos taken from surveillance cameras. I'm sorry, I didn't realize I actually had a limit. So I have a lot more to talk about, but I can stop if you want.
Why don't you wrap up?
Okay. So in any case, you can see the level of detail that you can get with this kind of technology. So I'm going to go through this quickly. Face recognition, license plate readers. I'd be happy to talk about this kind of stuff for the rest of the panel. But I think that the one last thing that I wanted to focus on is how do we get the Fourth Amendment to protect the rights that we had at the time the Constitution was written? And how do we protect especially some of the other rights that are in the Constitution, like the First Amendment? When we have video surveillance in society, or any kind of pervasive surveillance through cameras or drones, it impacts the ability to participate in society. We saw this recently with the Ukrainian government that sent a text message to everybody who participated in a political protest. The Ukrainian government was able to get access to the information on who was at that protest because they got records from the cell phone provider. And they sent a text message that said, I don't remember the exact text, but it said basically, we have knowledge that you were engaged in a political protest. Well, that creates a chilling effect on speech. And so when we have pervasive surveillance, it makes it much more difficult to participate anonymously in and engage in debate anonymously in public. So I'm going to close because my time is up, but I would be happy to talk about any of these things the rest of the panel.
Thank you.